Welcome to Crime Soup Podcast. I'm your host, Kaylee Carter.
And I'm Hannah.
And this week we'll be discussing the tragic story of Sheila Bellush. 13-year-old Stevie Bellush normally didn't rush home from school, but today she had some news that she could hardly wait to tell her mother about. A boy she liked had asked her out on a date. Stevie and her family had recently moved to Sarasota, Florida, and even though life had been really hard and confusing up to this point, things were starting to look up. Stevie had made friends, and she was adjusting to Florida well. Upon her arrival home, Stevie noticed that the front door was unlocked. This was red flag number 1. Her mother, Sheila Bellush, was extremely safety-oriented, even paranoid about keeping the doors locked at all times. Stevie walked inside and promptly called out for her mother. No answer. Red flag number 2. She only heard her 4 baby siblings crying, so she walked around the house looking for her mom and her siblings. She saw one of the babies crawling around, completely naked except for a life vest, and covered in something red. Another red flag. Stevie was growing more anxious by the second. Stevie knew that her mother must have taken the baby swimming in their indoor pool, but maybe they did an art activity instead? Something felt deeply wrong. One by one, as Stevie walked through the rooms, she found the 4 babies, all naked with life vests on and covered in red. Stevie continued to call out for her mother until she happened upon her mother, Sheila Bellush, lying on the floor of the kitchen, unconscious and surrounded by pools of her own blood. Sheila Lee Walsh was born October 1962 in Topeka, Kansas, to parents Jean and Frances Walsh. Jean and Frances had 4 daughters, but one of their babies died only 19 days old. Carrie, the youngest child, and Sheila, who were 5 years apart, were very close. Sheila also had 2 older half-brothers from her mother's first marriage. Sheila's father was in the Army, so they moved around a lot until her parents divorced. Frances Walsh was an alcoholic and had been an absent father. From then on, Sheila lived with her mother. Jean Walsh waited tables and worked long hours to support her family of 6 kids, and they were very poor. A few years after divorcing Frances, Jean met and married Don Smith. Jean's ex-husband and Sheila's father died in Vietnam in 1972, the same year Don and Jean were married, and Sheila's oldest brother, Donnie, committed suicide a year after that. At that point, Sheila's family was living in Salem, Oregon, and that's where Sheila went to high school, and where she ended up meeting Allen Van Hout. Sheila Lee Walsh was only 19 when she met Allen Van Hout. She was a small, petite woman, very beautiful. They met while she was working as a secretary for Allen's divorce lawyer, and she was trying to save money for college. Sheila was under the impression that this was Allen's first divorce, but she didn't learn until much later that he was actually on his second divorce. Allen was 7 years older, and Sheila was only 19. Sheila actually agreed to marry Allen on their 3rd date together, which we're going to talk about later, but that is love bombing. Allen was rich. He took her to country clubs, nice restaurants, bought her beautiful things. These were things that Sheila never had while she was growing up in poverty. Allen also impressed Sheila's family. He told Don Smith that he had also served in the Army and graduated from Stanford. Sheila's family was smitten with him, and Don Smith let Allen use their cars, their boats, anything that Allen wanted, Don Smith kind of went along with because he loved Allen. Allen was only 26 at this time, but he had somehow served in the Army and got residency, because I guess after 4 years you can leave. Is it called residency after you've been in the Army for a certain amount of years and you can leave?
I have no idea.
Me neither. But anyway, he had somehow served in the Army, served for 4 years, because I think that's the minimum requirement. But not only that, he said he had been a 2nd lieutenant in the Army. That sounds crazy. And got an engineering degree from Stanford, all in the time from when he was 18 to 26. And he had time to open a stereo store that was really successful. So I guess...
And be married twice.
And I guess if you're squeezing them all in, you could do it. But goddamn, that seems like a lot. Allen Van Hout was born in Eugene, Oregon to his 16-year-old mother and adult father. His father abandoned his mother after Allen was born. Allen's father would marry 5 times and father 9 children, but he only recognized, I think, 3 of his children. Allen's mother, only 16 and alone, left Allen with her parents in lieu of being a parent herself. Allen's grandparents raised him for a while, but around 7 or 8 years old, Allen began living with his aunt and uncle, Tom and Debbie Oliver. This is the same uncle. When he learned about Sheila's death, he immediately called police to accuse Allen of murdering her and told police that Allen always wins. According to Debbie and Tom, Allen tortured small animals, and as a child, he showed early interest in women. He avoided a rape charge in high school. He had a lot of petty crimes on his record, some vehicular, some theft, but most of it was expunged from his record when he turned 18. As a teenager, Allen left his Aunt Debbie's house to go live with his estranged father, stepmom, and their 2 sons. Allen and his stepmother did not get along, and she would later say that she hated what Allen did to their family. Allen would steal his stepmother's lingerie and wear it, and he continued this behavior his entire adult life. He never publicly identified as gay, transgender, or bisexual, but in his first marriage, he would force his wife to drop him off in the middle of the city while he wore nothing but women's lingerie and no plan to come home. He said he liked...
What?
Yeah, he said he liked the thrill of not knowing how or when he'd get home. So I'm not fully kink-shaming here, but none of what Allen did to his wives or stepmom was consensual. So all of the women who knew what he liked to do in the bedroom have gone on record saying that they didn't know beforehand and Allen forced them to participate. That's what's disgusting about this.
Well, because he knew that they wouldn't have agreed, probably.
Exactly. Yep. And his stepmom would have never agreed, obviously. Like... Like, imagine your fucking 17, 18-year-old stepson is stealing your lingerie and you're like, oh, it's fine. I think it's fine. No.
So, get your own lingerie.
Yeah,
God
for real. Don't wear mine. Nasty.
Yuck. Ew.
I don't want your ass on my lingerie. So Jean and Dawn Smith allowed Allen to move into their home before he and Sheila got married. And Allen was like actively courting Sheila's family while he was courting her. And he even talked Dawn Smith into going into business with him. So Allen at the time owned a video and stereo rental store called Capital Hi-Fi, but it was failing, and he didn't tell anybody this, but he wanted to get some new investors and rebrand. Sheila's stepdad was Allen's perfect target. Dawn Smith had good credit, and he agreed to invest in Allen's new business, Stereo World. But Allen was a terrible businessman, and Stereo World eventually failed and destroyed the Smiths' credit. But Allen didn't cue the Smiths in on the business troubles before it went up in flames, so they were totally blindsided by the failed venture. The Smith family had to file for bankruptcy, but luckily they didn't lose their home. Obviously, they were pissed at Allen and Sheila, but Sheila and Allen were already married with a baby girl, Stevie, and she was pregnant with her second child. So she got pregnant like right after. And Allen moved a pregnant Sheila, their baby daughter, and himself to Hawaii before the storm of the business failure hit the Smiths to avoid backlash from Sheila's family. Sheila had no idea that Allen had known it would fail. Sheila's family distanced themselves from her, and obviously tensions were extremely high. But Sheila's baby sister, Carrie, never turned her back on her. Carrie is an amazing sister and a huge support all throughout Sheila's life. I love this firecracker woman. So I'll tell you a little bit about her relationship with Allen. When Carrie was 15, Sheila was 20, and Allen was like 27 or 28 at the time. Allen tried to rape Carrie, but Carrie didn't say anything to Sheila because she didn't think she would believe her, but Carrie was able to fight Allen off. And as a result, Allen kept his distance from Carrie. And Carrie expressed later that she thinks he was intimidated by her because she refused to put up with his shit. And I could tell you about Allen's first and second wives. He was very, very abusive to both of them, and he used the children that he had with them against her. So Allen had how many children did he have? I can't remember. He had quite a few children, but he only recognized 4 of them. He only was in 4 of their lives. And even then, that was only for a time.
Well, what you've told me already about him reminds me of so many other true crime cases. It's already kind of haunting listening to it because I already kind of can tell where this is going to go.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find the other case. If you want to keep talking, there's another case I want to find that really reminds me of this.
Okay. So a little bit about his first wife. He forced her to put their first child up for adoption because he didn't want the child. And he said he would divorce her and a bunch of other bad things if she kept the child. So she unwillingly put her baby up for adoption, which is really sad in and of itself. She got pregnant a second time, and he was physically abusive, and he specifically beat her, targeting her stomach when she was in her, I think, second trimester with her second child. And she decided to get an abortion as the result of the beatings because she was worried about the baby's safety and then her own as well. And in that marriage, he also beat their dog to death for having an accident on the carpet. With his second wife had 2 children from a previous relationship, and Allen used her children to manipulate her, and he also was physically abusive. She was able to escape, and she actually went to Allen's aunt and uncle, and they were like, yes, let us help you get back on your feet, and then she disappeared. She eventually fled to California and was waiting tables there, and actually his aunt and uncle, the Olivers, ran into her by chance while she was waiting tables in California, and she was terrified and begged them not to tell Allen where she was, and they agreed. They promised they wouldn't. So his aunt and uncle knew that he was a terror.
This reminds me of, I found the case. So the one I was thinking of was the Christian Longo.
I don't know this case.
In the early 2000s, so Christian Longo was a family annihilator. It's a pretty famous case. I'm trying to remember the details, but essentially he just was really deceptive. He was entitled. I guess that's the best word for him, is that he's a very entitled man. He felt like he was entitled to his wife and his children and to money and to success. And he was constantly coming up with these business plans and trying to start businesses, but they were never successful. But that was a huge source of his pride, was having a nice lifestyle. And so he always was overspending, spending way too much money and just digging his family deeper and deeper into debt. I think at one point he did try and con some of his family members or in-laws or somebody to try and like co-sign on these businesses and things, but they didn't know that he was just conning them, and he was just hemorrhaging money and just so deep in the hole that you can't dig yourself out. You have to file for bankruptcy and all these things. It takes a big blow to their ego. And so then these men sometimes just lash out and kill their entire families or commit atrocities to try and start their life over again.
Yeah.
I have no idea where this case is going, but that's what it's reminding me of, is just these bad business decisions and these violent tendencies, and I don't know.
So that is really similar, and that is probably exactly what would have happened if Allen wasn't so well-connected and, I guess, manipulative. He conned a lot of people out of their money, and they always had money. Allen always had money. So he never was spending them broke, but he spent a lot of other people broke. Over and over. So when some people hear about men who abuse their partners and wives, they say, well, like, why didn't she leave? Why did she marry him if he was so terrible? And it's never that simple, and everyone's story is a little different. But Sheila was very young, and she didn't see many of the warning signs of Allen's abuse. He was actively love bombing her. Love bombing is when someone lavishes a person with like attention, affection, gifts to specifically manipulate them. And I'm sure you know this, but for any of our listeners who don't. And Allen successfully did this to a very young Sheila, but also her entire family. He conned all of them. And love bombing fits right into the cycle of abuse. So there's the different tenets of the cycle of abuse are love bombing. There's a honeymoon phase, so everything is good, lots of gifts, lots of attention, I love you all the time. Then there's the tension building phase, and like the partner is moody or nitpicks or yells, destroys property until it builds up to what the cycle calls an acute explosion, which can be like physical abuse, imprisonment, humiliation, rape. It looks different for each type of abusive relationship, but it's very common for all types of abusive people to follow this cycle. And Sheila had not been exposed to the worst of Allen before she was already trapped. She had a baby, another one on the way. Allen had severed her ties in good standing with her own family, so she had no one and nowhere else to go, really. And I do want to point out that Sheila's family didn't turn their backs on her, but they were obviously upset, and Allen kind of told them off, and they were angry at Allen, and so they kind of agreed to like distance themselves for Sheila's safety, because at that point they kind of suspected something might have been happening, and they didn't want to make Allen more angry. They still loved Sheila, but it was complicated. In the beginning, Allen treated Sheila like a possession. He seemed proud of her and would brag about his beautiful wife, but Sheila was so young and she didn't understand what he was doing. When Sheila was 6 months pregnant with her first daughter, Stevie, Allen intentionally ran a man and woman on a motorcycle off the road and killed them. It was a road rage. Yeah, it was a road rage situation. The woman who was riding on the back of the motorcycle had been flung onto the roof of the car, and Allen flailed the car wildly until she flew off. Sheila knew that Allen was violent before this, but at this moment, it was like a foreshadowing moment for her. The violence.
This is while she was pregnant?
Yeah, 6 months pregnant. So... The violence became real in a way, very real in a way that was outside of her. Allen ran from the accident and called his father. Since he was worried he had been seen, Allen's father advised him to go back to the scene, call 911, and say that the motorcyclist had been the aggressor, which is insane. Because the motorcyclist was not the aggressor. And Sheila talked about this.
Sheila knew.
Before she passed away, yeah. Before she was killed. She did not pass away. I guess I shouldn't say that. And yeah, his dad told him to say the motorcyclist had been the aggressor and that Allen was just trying to protect his pregnant wife. Allen was tried for leaving the scene without rendering assistance to the motorcyclist, but when the jury locked, meaning they couldn't reach a unanimous decision, it ended in a mistrial. So Allen got away with killing 2 people in a fit of road rage, and Sheila was witness to the whole thing. Imagine how helpless that would feel if you were a domestic violence victim, seeing your abuser literally get away with murder. Like, that has to send a chill down your spine. During the trial...
Yeah, because she knows that he's done it once, so if she comes forward, what's to say that he won't win the jury over again?
It makes an entitled man feel even more entitled, honestly, like even more powerful. He got away with murder. Mm-hmm. Right after this is happening, when Stevie, their first baby, was only a few months old, Sheila developed spinal meningitis, which is life-threatening, and she was in the hospital for a few weeks. Allen refused to visit her in the hospital, and forbade Jean, Sheila's mother, from visiting her. And they were all kind of scared of Allen at this point, so nobody visited her in the hospital the whole week she was there. I think she was in there for like a month.
What was his reasoning?
He just wanted to punish her. When she was released from the hospital, Allen said, "Oh, good, you're back." And he left healing Sheila to care for their newborn by herself while he spent all of his free time playing golf. And that is a reoccurring theme throughout his life. He played golf. That is all he did. So shortly after this is when Allen realized that his business started to fail, but didn't tell Sheila's stepdad. So while this is happening, Stereo World, the business that Don Smith invested in, is starting to fail, and Allen blindsided the Smiths by telling them he was filing for bankruptcy, and the Smiths also had to file. They lost all of their retirement, but they were able to keep their home. They had to start over with almost nothing because Allen took advantage of them. Sheila's mom and stepdad ended up moving to Mississippi to care for her stepdad's sick mother, but Carrie stayed in her parents' old home to finish high school with her older brother's family, and they ended up taking over the mortgage and stayed there. So Allen forced Sheila to cut ties with her family, and they respected her forced wishes, but Carrie refused to turn her back on her sister. Carrie worked 3 jobs and saved so she could visit Sheila in Hawaii. So while Allen was traveling in East Asia looking for another business opportunity, Carrie decided to visit. Sheila was pregnant again at this time, and Carrie said Sheila looked so thin and ill. Allen did end up finding his new business venture, and he conned one of his sister's rich boyfriends into investing into his new business that he called Healthtronic. And this little device they were trying to sell was, it's like a little electroshock muscle relaxer thing. And the reason they were selling it as like a health device. Like, you attach it to you and it shocks the fat so that you don't have to exercise. It like makes your muscles bigger and burns fat. That's how they were trying to advertise it. And he brought his brother and his dad to Honolulu to join this business venture with him. Allen's violence against Sheila persisted, and he even got brave enough to pin pregnant Sheila up against a wall by her neck. Like, her feet were dangling in front of his father and brother, but they said nothing. Allen's dad did say later that Allen was terrible. Like, he tried to separate himself from him, but he's just as bad. Carrie said that even though she suspected abuse, Allen never abused Sheila in front of her. So Carrie ended up going back home. She stayed with Sheila for a few weeks, went back home. But Sheila did have a full-time nanny in Hawaii named Jonda. And shortly after Daryl, Sheila's second baby, was born, Allen's new business ended in a huge scandal. So he failed to get FDA approval. So since his father and brother were part of the venture, after he was released, his brother and father were still trying to modify the product to get FDA approval. But Allen took Sheila and his 2 babies and fled to San Antonio, Texas, in order to avoid any more backlash from the law. And his plan was to leave his dad and brother to the wolves. He thought it would fail, and he didn't want any part of it. So when they got to Texas, Allen Van Hout changed his last name to Blackthorn. He claimed it was because he found out that Guy Van Hout wasn't his biological dad, and it was just another guy with a name Blackthorn. But in reality, Sheila knew it was because he was trying to hide from his dad and his creditors. Sheila knew at this point that she needed to get out, but she didn't have the means to do so. She had worked for other law offices everywhere they had moved, and she got a job in San Antonio as well. Jonda, their nanny in Hawaii, moved with them to San Antonio, but Jonda had only been with the family for 6 months total before she couldn't take Allen anymore and decided to move to California. She and Sheila still remained close, though. Even though Sheila had a job, Allen began accusing her of being a gold digger, having affairs, and even saying that their second daughter, Daryl, wasn't his. None of this was true. It was clearly projection because Allen was the one cheating.
Their daughter is named Daryl?
Yes. So actually, I'll tell you a little bit. Their first daughter is Stevie and their second daughter was Daryl. And the reason, so Allen picked out both of these names. And the reason he picked them out, he told Sheila it was because of Stevie Nicks and another singer, Daryl something, I can't remember. But the real reason was that Allen was using their social security numbers and committing identity fraud. So he could,
what?
Yeah, so he could pose because they're like male coded names a little bit. So he could use them for himself to open more credit accounts in. So he
was playing that before they were even born.
He was planning it before they were even born. Yeah, so a lot of his business partners, when I was reading into this, were super weirded out by him because he would brag about like having sex with prostitutes and beating up strippers, and like he would brag about this stuff, and all of his business partners would kind of like laugh it off. They thought it was weird, but nobody ever called him out on it, and nobody ever took him seriously either. They were just like, this guy is weird, but whatever. So nobody ever held him accountable ever. And he had a lot of power and influence in the communities that he went to. Allen was the one cheating. He brought women home and had sex with them in their bed, like loudly, while Sheila huddled with her daughters in the next room. And he even brought a male sex worker to live with them for a while, like in their house. He was just the fucking worst. I hate this guy. I say that every time I tell you a story about someone terrible like this. I'm like, I hate him. I hate him. I would beat the shit out of him if I saw him in person. No questions. I'd be like, hold me back. Actually, don't hold me back.
I could not hold you back.
No, you could not. No one would be able to stop me. So EMS Medical was his new business venture, and it was wildly successful. In early 1987, Sheila had decided that she had enough of Allen's abuse. She was ready to leave, and he was growing more and more violent. He tried to drown her in a toilet, and he beat her so badly that she decided to call the police. He was arrested and charged with misdemeanor battery for beating Sheila, which had a fine of $100 and no jail time.
$100?
$100 and no jail time. Don't go to San Antonio, Texas if you're being abused, y'all.
If you're an abuser, you're gonna move there.
Yeah. But so Allen was taken. He had to spend the night in jail, a 24-hour sentence. And before Allen could bond out of his 24-hour jail sentence, Sheila decided she had to leave. She drove to Jonda's house in California. Allen figured out where she was going, hopped on a plane, and ended up meeting Sheila in Jonda's driveway. Jonda was able to get the girls inside of her house, but Allen dragged Sheila onto the driveway and began beating her. Like in public, beating the shit out of her in the middle of the street. A male neighbor saw what was happening and tried to intervene, but Allen jumped into Sheila's car, ran the neighbor over, and crashed into Jonda's fence, then drove away. Allen was not going to leave California without Sheila, so he came back a few hours later, but luckily the police were there. He was arrested, slapped with a $425 fine, and had to serve 18 months of probation. Luckily the neighbor lived, but he got nothing. Like, he didn't even get in trouble for this.
$425 to hit someone with your car and beat up your wife?
And 18 months probation. He's getting away.
What does that even mean?
It just means you have to not get in trouble with the cops for 18 months.
Yeah.
That's it. And in reality, he probably only had to serve 18 months probation in California. So he was going to go back to San Antonio, Texas. And even if he had gotten in trouble with the cops, like, I don't even know if they would have known.
So probation just means like, does probation just mean like this is your first strike? Like, we've got our eye on you, but not really?
Yeah, I guess. He did have to serve a 24-hour jail sentence in California, though. He was booked for 24 hours. And while he was in jail, she drove to Oregon to be with her sister Carrie. And Allen was too scared to come get Sheila at Carrie's house. He probably knew how much Carrie hated him. And if I were Carrie, I would wish that a bitch would come to my house because I'd shoot his ass. I'd be waiting for the motherfucking day. And that's probably what Carrie was feeling too. She's like, ooh, I wish a bitch would. I wish he'd come here. And that's probably why he never showed up to Carrie's, honestly. So Sheila and her girls stayed in Oregon for a few weeks. And then after building her physical and mental strength up, she decided to go back to San Antonio to pursue a divorce. She lived in an apartment complex that had other victims of domestic violence. She lived in an apartment complex that other victims of domestic violence also lived in. And she still had her job at the law office. She filed for divorce and custody of both of her girls. The divorce was finalized in September of 1988. She got primary custody, her car, and $1,200 a month in child support. There is no alimony in Texas, and Allen didn't fight her on the divorce, but he probably knew that as long as she was in Texas, he could try to control her still. Soon after, Allen offered to buy Sheila a house, but it had to be in his neighborhood so he could see the girls. She said no, but he kept pushing it, and she was still hesitant, but she eventually agreed.
No!
Yeah, and after only 6 months of staying in the house, she regretted it. So she saved up and bought a small 2-bedroom house in a different neighborhood and moved out. And that's when Allen started to wage war. He stopped paying child support, so she would take him to court, and when she did, he would sue her for full custody. Sheila always won, but the cycle continued for literally years. He was trying to wear her down and drain her of resources. Eventually, Allen sold EMS Medical, his successful business venture he started in Texas when he and Sheila were still married, and started a new company called RS Medical. While there isn't alimony in Texas, like I said, there is a thing called communal property, and that meant that Sheila was entitled to 20% of the profits of EMS Medical. But Allen hid assets, and she only saw about $20,000 when she was owed over $250,000. I don't know how you get away with that, honestly. Like, it doesn't matter if you hid assets. If she's entitled to it, she should be entitled to it. That makes no sense to me that they were like, oh, I guess, sorry, you only have $20,000.
Does he, yeah, so is it that she's only entitled to, like, liquid assets and he's, like, buying up stock somewhere else? Or is he, like, hiding the money in offshore accounts or something?
What really happened is that he hired an assistant named Virginia who worked out of his home, and he transferred a lot of stuff into her name so that it wasn't technically in his name.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah. And then he would take it back. But Virginia, like I said, worked and kind of stayed at his home, and she was the one who primarily watched Stevie and Daryl when Allen had his turn with the girls, because he was busy traveling or playing golf. Sheila tried to move on with her life and ended up meeting a man named Jamie Bellush in 1992, and they got married in 1993. He was a pharmaceutical rep, very religious, and Jamie was head over heels for Sheila. He was just smitten. But on the night of Sheila and Jamie's rehearsal dinner, Allen was supposed to return the girls after he had them for the weekend, but instead he served Sheila with court papers suing her for more visitation. So she married Jamie the next day, but she missed her honeymoon because she had to show up for a court hearing to fight Allen the next day. Like, he did it on purpose because he kept trying to sabotage her life in any way he could. Any type of power he could have over her, he tried to assert. Even if it was small, even if it was petty. I mean, I think that's not really small, but it is petty as hell.
These guys are like a disease. Like, this is like a fungus that you catch that, like, you can't get rid of. It just, like, is there all the time. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
It's like a wart or glitter, something that just doesn't come off.
In 1994, so a year after Sheila got married, Allen married again. He married a woman named Maureen. She came from a super, super wealthy family. I'll tell you a little bit more about her later. So Stevie, Sheila's oldest daughter, had begun saying that her daddy was touching her. And although Sheila couldn't prove it, she obviously suspected Allen of sexually abusing their daughter. So I've worked in an SVU. Something I've learned is that if a little kid tells you something explicit, more likely than not, it's because it's happening to them or they are witnessing it. Either way, you should believe that something is happening. Stevie's daycare teacher one day called Sheila and told her that on days when her dad brought her in, she was withdrawn and she even smelled like sex. Sheila immediately put Stevie into counseling, but didn't want to accuse Allen when Stevie was in such a fragile state because she could be scared to say something if asked, right? She would have to testify against her dad in court during a really fragile time, and so Sheila was trying to protect Stevie. Sheila waited until Allen filed another bogus court case against Sheila, and when Sheila told him that she was going to bring sexual assault allegations against him in court, Allen dropped the suit entirely. So he's scared.
How old was Stevie at this point?
Around 8 and 9 years old.
Okay.
Stevie soon started refusing to go see her father on her own, and Allen decided to use Daryl, who he had ignored purposefully in favor of Stevie. He started to groom Daryl. Sheila's new husband, Jamie, wanted children of his own, but Sheila had her tubes tied because she knew that she couldn't escape Allen if she kept having children. So they were having some fertility issues and looked into IVF. Sheila got pregnant through IVF with quadruplets. Doctors normally advise...
Okay, when you said earlier that there was 4 babies, I was like, what
the
is
hell?
going on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
She got pregnant with quadruplets. And doctors normally advise selective abortion because the chances of complications for the fetuses and the mother get super high when there's this many. But because Jamie and now Sheila were super religious, they refused.
She would have had to have done like a really early C-section?
Yes, but she was on bed rest the last 4 months of her pregnancy. But all babies made it through the planned cesarean delivery. So they became local celebrities because of the quadruplets. It was around this time that Carrie came to visit Sheila and the babies. And around the same time is when O.J. Simpson had just been acquitted for allegedly killing his wife. And Sheila told Carrie that she thinks Allen thought since O.J. got away with it, he could get away with killing her too. And she made Carrie promise that if anything happened to her, that she would look after her children. And she also asked Carrie to reach out to Anne Rule, a prevalent true crime writer, and tell her story if Allen ever murdered her. So at this point, Sheila knew what was going to happen to her, and Carrie kept her word. The Bellushes moved in together after their marriage, and Jamie was an authoritarian-style parent, and also was new to being a parent, so he would punish Stevie and Daryl by spanking them with belts and wooden spoons. Now, the girls had been through a lot, and Allen had often beaten the girls in the same way and worse, but he also let them get away with a lot of stereotypical bad behavior to spite Sheila. Like, he didn't let the girls clean up their messes because they had maids for that. He said yes to things that Sheila specifically said no to, and he bought them whatever they wanted. So I guess from a very non-professional psychological standpoint, even though Allen was extremely abusive, he was familiar, which makes a lot of difference for children dealing with abuse. Jamie was the new guy trying to assert his dominance as a father figure in their life, and they were not adjusting well, rightfully so, I think. Just because what Allen did was worse doesn't make what Jamie did okay, in my opinion. In March 1997, Daryl ran over to Pat Aday's house, the Bellush's next-door neighbor, when Sheila threatened to spank her. Pat called Allen and the police. Allen came over and really dramatically rescued Daryl from Sheila and Jamie. Like this man wasn't beating the shit out of Sheila and both of his kids on a different day. Police came but left when they learned that Daryl had not been hit. Allen called CPS and a case was opened, specifically because they found out that Jamie was using belts and spoons to spank his stepkids. Like I said,
this is really, really bad because if she and Jamie are starting to abuse these kids, then it's just going to fuel Allen's different cases because he's trying to get more custody, right?
Exactly. Like I said, I personally don't think this was okay. CPS ordered Jamie into counseling, but said that they didn't think his actions were overtly abusive. But Jamie did comply with the counseling, and he did promise to change, and he made efforts to change. Remember how I pointed out that Allen was actively grooming Daryl at this point? This incident really helped Allen accomplish this to a new level. He became Daryl's protector when Daryl felt like she had none. Her mom was busy with 4 new babies. Her stepdad was hitting her with belts when she acted out. She had no safe spaces, so she started going to Pat Aday's house much more often. And Pat Aday became kind of like an informant to Allen. She kept tabs on what was happening at the Bellush house and reported back to Allen all the time. Nothing exceptional was happening at the Bellush's house, but the constant reporting on Sheila fanned the flame on Allen's obsessive hatred of her. Out of all of Allen's victims, Sheila was the best off. Even though Allen had made it his life's mission to make her life hell, Sheila was trying to thrive, and that just made Allen super angry. He was constantly trying to assert control wherever he could, and that's why he was grooming Daryl. There's so much documented evidence about his interactions with his kids, and I can't get into all of it or this would be like a 3-hour episode. But Allen did not care about people unless they could do something for him. Allen only showed love to Daryl when he needed to get information to attack Sheila, and then he would drop her, and this cycle continued for basically Daryl's whole young life. So all Allen did was be terrible and play golf, like I said, so he ended up meeting... this guy named Danny Roca at the country club where he golfed. Danny considered himself to be a professional golfer, and fun fact, Allen sucked ass at golf. And Danny would...
Of course he did.
Yeah. He sucked at everything. That's why he was... the worst. But Danny would hustle Allen out of a ton of money from golf bets. And Maureen, Allen's wife at the time, bought him golf lessons with Danny. So Danny and Allen were getting close, and Allen would often confide about his hatred for Sheila to Danny. Danny Roca and Allen were on a plane for a golf trip to Oregon when Allen got messy drunk and asked to hire Danny to hurt Sheila. This was the first time Allen asked Danny to do this. Danny said that Allen talked about wanting to leave Sheila blind, in a wheelchair, and just generally unable to care for her kids. Roca did not take him seriously the first time Allen asked, thinking that it was just ranting. In June 1997, Allen filed a contempt of court motion against Sheila because Stevie refused to go visit him. probably because he had been assaulting her, right? And this was the last straw for Sheila. She filed a protective order for Stevie against Allen and asked for an increase in child support. She asked the counselor Stevie saw after the sexual abuse came out to testify in court on Stevie's behalf. Allen responded by withdrawing his suit completely, and then he immediately filed to give up all parental rights to his daughters.
Why?
This right here is just proof to me that he was doing this to try and control Sheila, not out of concern for his kids. So he just dropped them completely. His lawyer and the judge were like, whoa, don't do this. But he didn't care.
You're saying it had nothing. He didn't even care about having...
No, like he was doing this
parental
to
rights.
Punish Sheila at this point. Like, you want to accuse me of sexual assault and I don't want to get in trouble. So fuck you. You're not getting any support and child support. And I'm just... withdrawing my rights completely because it punishes the girls, which therefore makes Sheila's life harder. At this point, his wife Maureen and him at the time had 2 kids, and they had just bought a 9,000 square foot mansion, and all Allen did was golf. He and Maureen had an interesting relationship. Before they got married, Sheila did reach out to Maureen and try and warn her about what she went through with Allen, but Maureen didn't care. She came from a super wealthy family and was an executive at Hewlett-Packard when she met Allen. And Allen let Maureen control all their finances, which is a switch up from Allen's previous relationships. And Allen and Maureen both hated Sheila, and Maureen even started calling Sheila the Black Cow. It was later revealed that the code name for Sheila's murder plot was Black Cow. When Allen gave up his parental rights, all contact with his daughters was supposed to cease immediately, but Daryl still called her dad in secret. Allen welcomed this because he found out that the Bellush family was planning on moving out of state, but he didn't know where they were going, and he was actively planning with Danny Roca for a hit on Sheila, so he needed that information. So, as we have surmised, Allen was able to find Sheila, and Sheila was murdered. So, because of the blood trail, investigators could tell that the attack started in the laundry room and went through the kitchen. Sheila had been shot in the face with a .45 caliber bullet. The bullet entered her cheek and exited through the back of her neck. She dropped to her knees so hard that bruises were left behind, but she wasn't dead yet. She staggered back to her feet and tried to make her way to the kitchen phone. Sheila's killer grabbed an 8-inch butcher knife from the kitchen and slashed her throat, but Sheila fought back hard. She had a stab wound that went completely through one hand, 2 slashes on either side of her neck that hit her jugular vein, but not the carotid artery. The coroner said that if she had been able to get medical attention, she would have lived. Sheila wasn't dead when the killer left. She managed to pull the phone off the hook, but wasn't able to dial before she fell unconscious. Poor Stevie had been the one to find her mother, and when she called 911, she told investigators that she knew who did it, her dad, Allen Blackthorn. But she said that he didn't do it himself. He was smart enough to pay someone to do it. Her younger siblings had been alone with their deceased mother for probably close to 7 hours in the house.
Oh my God.
One of the toddlers, who was the most verbal out of the 4, cried that Mommy had a boo-boo and the man had done it. The toddlers were found covered in her blood, and really sad stuff that nobody needs to know, but I guess based on the blood splatter, one of the toddlers had been clutching onto her leg when she died, like when she was shot initially. So investigators were able to find a fingerprint in the blood, but that was all they had until a witness came forward. A man who owned a landscaping company had been in the neighborhood on the day of Sheila's death. While mowing lawns near the Bellush's house, he saw a white Mitsubishi park and then a large man wearing camo get out and start walking toward the Bellush's house. This stood out to the landscaper enough for him to memorize the license plate number just in case.
You didn't say how old the babies were. If they're able to actually string together like 2 words to create a thought, that usually means that they're close to 18 months or 2 years old.
Yeah, they were. I think they were just under 2. The plate was registered to an elderly woman in Texas, but she didn't use the car anymore. Her grandson did. Police were able to run the fingerprint, and it came back as the same person who used the car, 21-year-old Joey Del Toro. So the plan was that Allen harassed Danny Roca about killing Sheila too many times for Danny to recall. Danny says that he offered to pay him more and more money every time they spoke about it. When all was said and done, it only took an offering of $9,000 to get Danny to agree to it. But Danny, on principle of not hurting women, outsourced the actual murder to Sammy Gonzalez, who is a caddy at the country club.
Okay, hold on. On principle doesn't want to harm women, but is okay
he outsourced
being friends with violent men and outsourcing it to people who are... No, that doesn't make... I'm sorry.
Exactly, yeah. You can read this dripping sarcasm in my voice.
That's being like, I don't believe in harming animals, but I own a dog fighting ring.
Literally, exactly. I don't harm them myself. The dogs do it to each other. Like, what?
I just facilitate it.
Yeah. So Sammy Gonzalez was a caddy at the country club. Danny paid Sammy $4,000 to do this, and he pocketed the other $5,000. Sammy, also very principled about not hurting women, asked his 21-year-old cousin, Joey Del Toro, to kill Sheila. Joey Del Toro was a small-town high school football star. He was well over 6 feet tall and had kept his athletic physique even after high school. He had been very popular and well-liked, but he was now a cocaine addict living with his grandmother. The reason Del Toro got caught was because he had been arrested for shoplifting, so his prints were on record. Allen promised Danny Roca $50,000 if he got his daughters back in his own custody, which meant that Sheila had to die. But even this doesn't make a ton of sense because he gave up his parental rights, so he had no rights to the girls at all. And I assume Jamie adopted them, but even if he didn't, he was still their legal guardian. And I'm sure there's a legal possibility of Allen getting Stevie and Daryl back into his possession, but it wouldn't be easy. So, like, nobody considered the reality of this here. And it was because Allen didn't really care about getting his daughters back. He wanted to hurt Sheila. That was it. He knew that he probably wasn't going to get his kids back, I'm assuming. I'm making a character judgment here, and I don't think I'm far off. I think he knew he wasn't going to get his girls back, but he didn't care as long as Sheila was brutally maimed or killed. And I think he was hoping killed.
I also want to point out, I'm not a psychologist and I don't understand the significance of it, but do you think it's significant at all that it wasn't him personally to harm her? He wanted her harmed. He wanted her killed or maimed or whatever. I'm surprised that he didn't want to do it himself.
I think he knew he had a lot to lose, because he did. And I think he knew that he wouldn't get away with it if he tried to do it himself, for a few reasons. I think he knew he would be violent enough to leave evidence. And I think he knew that it would be easy to track where he had been. It'd be less easy to track where somebody else had been. She wasn't that important to him. It was ruining her life that was important to him, even if it wasn't him doing the actual murder. What do you think?
It shows a degree of calculation. It shows, a lot of obvious premeditation.
Yeah.
It's just, I wonder, like, psychologically how they categorize these killers, because in my mind, he is a killer.
He absolutely is.
Even though he didn't physically shoot her or strangle her or whatever, he killed those motorcyclists. Is it just because he has money?
Yeah, I think he was...
Do you think more men would actually hire out killers if they had the means to do it?
100%. Men who don't even have the means to do it still do it. Yeah, but I do believe that. In the end, Sammy Gonzalez gave the $4,000 given to him from Danny Roca to Joey Del Toro. So Joey killed Sheila for $4,000. When they were all caught, Sammy Gonzalez was the first to make a deal. He was sentenced to 30 years in Texas and then 19 years in Florida. He was released from Florida in 2014, and his records have not been found in the Texas prison system, so it's possible that he didn't have to serve his Texas sentence, like he was able to parole out or something. Danny Roca did not make any plea deals. He was under the impression that he could pin it all on Allen and walk away from any prison time, but that did not work out for him. He ended up having to take a plea deal at the last second to avoid the death penalty. He was given 2 life sentences that he continues to fight against to this day.
Well, so, because he was kind of a middleman, right?
He was the one that Allen technically hired to do it. And then he hired somebody else to do it.
Okay. He's the subcontractor?
Yeah.
He's the general contractor, and he's hiring subcontractors.
Exactly. The world's worst MLM. Not really an MLM, but same vibes. Joey Del Toro fled to Mexico and fought extradition for over a year, even though he was an American citizen and should have been deported. But someone was paying some pretty hefty attorney fees to fight the United States. It turns out that Allen had been paying for Joey Del Toro's attorney. But Del Toro was eventually sent back to the U.S., and Joey, not wanting to go to trial, accepted 2 life sentences as part of a plea deal, and he spilled everything. Danny, Sammy, Joey, and Allen's longtime secretary, Virginia, all turned on Allen. Maureen, Allen's wife, was never charged in the conspiracy to kill Sheila, even though she tangentially had a huge part in Sheila's murder. But because she never spoke with the man who actually killed Sheila, she was able to absolve herself of legal responsibility.
I feel like she's actually a lot smarter than we give her credit.
Oh, she's hella smart. She's super smart.
She already was like a successful business owner, right? She was like a multimillionaire or something.
Yep.
And then she probably knew like I'm gonna get in trouble for this if I don't like. I think she danced around it and managed to keep herself out of trouble.
Yeah. Yep, I think you're exactly right. But she and Allen had an entire section of their garage that was dedicated to stalking Sheila.
What?
Like there were photos, news clippings, and charts taped to a wall in the Blackthorns' garage. And they would go out there and just stew over it and just hate Sheila together. Like, what the fuck is up with that?
Okay, but what reason did she have to hate her besides that it's just her husband's ex-wife?
Think about it. If
is that it?
I have a friend who was in a super abusive, like physically abusive relationship. And before she married her abuser, his ex reached out to her and tried to warn her and said, hey, I have like police reports and stuff of everything he did to me. Please do not marry this man. He's dangerous. And my friend was so far in it at the time that she was like, this lady's trying to break us up. And then that was reinforced by her abuser, who was also like, she's lying about everything. And she wants to get back together with me. And that's why she's doing this. She's trying to get in between us. And it was also like my friend was pregnant at the time. And so she felt really vulnerable. And like she couldn't question his loyalty because she couldn't afford to, I guess. Like not mentally, not emotionally. She couldn't, it was putting a lot on the line. And so she trusted the person that she thought loved her. And it turned out very badly for her. But I imagine that's kind of what happened with Maureen. Like Sheila reached out to her and was like, this guy is terrible. And Allen was like, she still wants to get back together with me. Like she tries to hold my kids against me. Like she's trying to ruin my life.
And she's only getting his side of the story.
Exactly. I imagine it was kind of like that.
I can only imagine what Allen is saying about Sheila and what kind of narrative he's spinning and how horrible he's making her look.
In the court documents, it shows a lot of exactly what he said. Danny and Joey Del Toro highlighted exactly what they were told about Sheila. And actually, Joey, when he was being interviewed after he had been arrested, he claims that he got in the house, he broke in and saw Sheila being a wonderful mother to her children and had guilt about having to kill her. And so he went to leave, but Sheila saw him. And so he felt like he had to go through with the murder.
No.
Yeah. I think it's kind of bullshit. I think he was going to do it anyway, but maybe because he was told that she was a super abusive, awful mother who beat her kids and abused them and neglected them. But he watched her being a loving, doting mother to her 4 little babies and had some guilt about it. But I am not 100% sure if I believe that. And he killed her anyway. So it doesn't matter.
Doting on the quad.
Yeah, on the quads. On January 4th, 2000, 44-year-old Allen was indicted by a federal grand jury on 1 count of conspiring to use interstate commerce in the commission of murder for hire and 1 count of causing another to cross state lines to commit domestic violence. He was arrested that same day. Allen was denied bail due to being perceived as a flight risk, obviously, because he was. Prosecutors decided to pursue Allen in federal court rather than a Florida state court because federal courts have more access to evidence. They wouldn't have to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. Just the rules are different. And the judge primarily asks the questions instead of attorneys. So plus if Allen happened to be acquitted, he could still be charged in both Texas and Florida state courts. The state prosecutors didn't want to leave anything to chance, so they handed over their jurisdiction to pursue Allen over to the feds. Luckily, the jury found Allen guilty on both accounts and was sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole in federal prison. After only a few years of being in prison while serving time in a Texas federal prison, Allen was stabbed several times, like in the chest area and the eye, with a screwdriver by another inmate. But he survived. This man is like a fucking roach, I tell ya. He always comes back. But on November 20th, 2014, at 59 years old, Allen was in a U.S. penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, and he died, but his cause of death was not released. So they finally brought the raid out to kill this man. And I know that's really callous to say, but I hate him. I really do hate him, and I think he made so many people's life hard, and he murdered his ex-wife. I hate him. He deserves the worst things in life, and he got them, luckily, but not enough. Daryl went to live with Carrie. Jamie had trouble forgiving little Daryl, who had been so heartlessly manipulated by Allen, and it damaged their relationship forever. Stevie stayed with Jamie to help with the quadruplets. Jamie was able to take Allen to civil court for financial compensation, and Jamie settled with about $4.1 million, all to be equally distributed between all of Sheila's children. Stevie and Daryl changed their names, and I hope their lives got better after this. If you are the victim of domestic violence, we know how hard it is to leave, but having a support system makes all the difference. Please do not hesitate to ask for help in making a plan to leave. You can start by calling or texting the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233. It's also so valuable to know the warning signs of abuse before you suddenly find yourself in the thick of it. The National Domestic Violence Hotline also has a website with some educational information. Please look into it. And look out for those signs in your friends and family members as well. Everyone leaves their abusers on their own time. Please be understanding if you know someone who is not ready to leave. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Crime Soup Podcast. Be sure to find us on social media and let us know your thoughts on this case. You can find us on YouTube and TikTok at Crime Soup Podcast and on Instagram and Twitter at crime_soup. We also have a website, crimesouppodcast.com, where you can listen to all of our episodes and buy your very own Crime Soup merch. As always, we'll see you next Tuesday. Stay safe and bon appetit.